We're now going to start in on one of my all-time favorite topics in this course, where we're going to be thinking some more about the whole notion of natural selection. And in particular, we're going to explore some puzzles, talk a little bit about types of natural selection, and then we're going to talk about the shapes of selection. And this is my favorite part of the course because we get to talk about all kinds of wild animal stories. So we're going to start out with these puzzles. So here's our first puzzle. Our first puzzle comes from an observation that is now referred to as sexual dimorphism. And in a nutshell, what sexual dimorphism is cases where males and females of a species look very different from each other. So we observe this in a lot of cases in nature, and so we want to know why this happens. And along with this, in particular, in a number of cases where males and females look different, often we've noted that the males in particular have traits that seem like they're going to give the males a poorer survival value. So for example, in this slide here, I've got this picture of this bright red cardinal. And cardinal's a pretty tasty size for other birds to snack on, like hawks or eagles. And so given that, it seems like it would not be a good idea to be bright red because you're going to stand out in stark contrast to your surroundings. We can see sexual dimorphism in other species like lions, where here's a male and female. The male having this large exaggerated mane, so looking quite different from the female. And then on the right side here is a really wacky example of a type of fly called a stalk-eyed fly. So these are the fly's eyeballs out on the tips of these stalks, really far away from its head. And let's just take a look at a quick video of this fly just to see how wild they are. Alright, so here's a quick video of a stalk-eyed fly just walking around. So, how does it even work, having your eyeballs out on stalks far away from your body? Doesn't make any sense. So, that's the question. So, these seem like traits that are going to make it really hard for these organisms to survive. So, how could that have happened? All right, so that's going to bring us back to the point about biological fitness, right? So, fitness really has two parts to it: survival and reproduction. So if something is harmful for survival purposes, what that suggests is then that thing must have some kind of advantage as far as reproduction goes. So for example, males that have these traits must somehow mate more frequently or get more matings than males that do not have these traits. And that has to balance or exceed the survival costs of that trait. So how might this work specifically? Let's take a look at some examples. The first type of reproductive advantage comes from a type of seal, a very popular topic, I realize, known as an elephant seal. And so in elephant seals, the males, we can see again this sexual dimorphism at work, where a male elephant seal is much, much larger than a female elephant seal is. And these male elephant seals actually have these contests with each other. They're these really dramatic battles. So let's take a look at one of those. Okay, so this is just from Wikipedia. So here's a video of male elephant seals. Getting ready to face off with each other. And kapow! So it might not look like much, but you have to remember that these things can weigh close to a ton when they're smacking into each other. They're biting each other. This is a pretty vicious fight. I can guarantee you if one of those elephant seals came up to you and started acting that aggressively, you would probably turn tail and leave. Okay, so in this situation, basically the largest elephant seal male is the one that tends to win, and that dominant male usually gets over 80% of the matings in an elephant seal colony. So this is one type of reproductive advantage that might exist that we refer to as male-male competition for mates. Right, so the male who wins winds up having opportunities to reproduce with more females. And again, there is a survival cost to this in that male elephant seals tend to die younger than the females do. So that's one type of reproductive advantage. Here is another type of reproductive advantage. So here's a bird called the widow bird, and you'll notice that this bird has this incredibly lustrous, glorious long tail. And again, this is the male. And this type of trait is common across many species, where males of a lot of different species have characteristics that we refer to as ornaments. So it's an exaggerated trait that doesn't really have a lot of practical utility as far as we can tell. Okay, so they have these long tails, and the other hypothesized type of reproductive advantage is referred to as female preference. So there must be something about this long, lustrous tail that is attractive to females. That's the idea here. So that might be another type of reproductive advantage that could help to explain the existence of this strange ornament. Okay, so to test this hypothesis that has to do with female preference, Malte Anderson conducted this experiment back in 1982, and I always think it sounds like a really fun experiment to do once you've captured the birds. So what he did was he varied the length of the bird's tail by either removing or adding tail feathers. So you can see kind of a picture of those treatment groups over here. So we've got shortened tails, long tails, and then he also had a control treatment where he went through the same procedure as he did with the shorter long tails, but he kept the tail length the same. So that helped to control for any side effects of having handled the birds and adjusted their tail length. So he took a group of these widow birds, he changed their tail length, and then he released them back into the wild and then observed what happened. And first off, what he found was that all of the males, regardless of their tail length, were still able to defend a territory. So what that indicates is that in this case, tail length is not contributing to male-male competition if they're all equally capable of defending a territory, so no competitive advantage. However, he did find that there were 4 times as many females nested in areas with these elongated tailed males. And so you can see that here as on the y-axis in this figure, this is the average number of nests per male, right? So if you have a short tail, sorry buddy, you're not in luck. If you have a regular tail length, we're close to about 1 nest per male, and here at the elongated, an average of 2 nests per male, and in some cases up to 4 times as many. And in addition to that, the females that were nesting in areas with males with these elongated tails had more eggs in those territories. So that supported this hypothesis that that exaggerated trait could have to do with or have evolved thanks to female preference for that exaggerated trait. So that tells us that there is a type of selection where we see this sexual dimorphism. We refer to this as sexual selection. So that causes dimorphic traits in males versus females, right? And so that shows that yes, this can operate either through male-male competition or through female choice. And both of these can result in selection for sexual dimorphism or some other kind of showy trait or ornament. And these two things are actually also not mutually exclusive. So it could be that a trait is useful for both male-male competition and that the females find that trait more attractive. And I'm going to let you think about ways to kind of extrapolate beyond about that concept. And so just in case you want to see it, here's a video of some of those stock-eyed flies getting lucky. All right, so Darwin was thinking about these ideas also, and he had a lot of observations of bird behavior. And here's his remark about birds and mating. So he said, "Inasmuch as the act of courtship appears to be with many birds a prolonged and tedious affair, so it occasionally happens that certain males and females do not succeed during the proper season in exciting each other's love and consequently do not pair." Probably true for this mandarin duck that showed up in Central Park in 2018. It's in the wrong environment. It'd probably have a hard time finding a mate. As a side note, sexual selection gets to be really wild when you start talking about ducks. Just in case you don't believe me, Google sexual selection in ducks. So that was one selection puzzle, resolved by identifying that as a case of sexual selection. Here's another selection puzzle. Let's think about a genetically based phenotype that benefits a species but has a cost to the individual that bears that phenotype. And I think this is a good point to pause the video and ask yourself, what would you expect to happen to that kind of phenotype from an evolutionary standpoint? So how is selection going to respond to that? So one example of this is alarm calls in ground squirrels. So if a ground squirrel happens to spot a coyote, it will then give off a warning call after seeing that coyote. Just to give you some examples of what that looks like. All right, so there's some California ground squirrels emitting alarm calls. Notice this one's holding still while it's producing that call. So its location is extremely obvious while it is giving off that call. So it's just sitting there waiting to turn into a snack for a hawk. That does not seem like a good idea. And to give you a second example, so here's a gray squirrel. Okay, so you may hear squirrels making that noise as you're walking around campus. So my question is, how could that trait exist from an evolutionary standpoint? It seems like a great way for a squirrel to just turn into a snack for the nearest predator. So we'll talk more about how that could occur during lecture. But we should continue to think about selection here. So now let's think about a population of deer that has genetic variation and phenotypic variation for running speed. And as we're imagining this hypothetical population, let's also imagine that a new predator moves in, and this new predator imposes selection on the population for faster speed. So this is common for a lot of type of predators. It's going to run after prey, and so it's going to catch all of the slowest deer in that population. So take a moment and just jot down notes to yourself about what you think is going to happen to the phenotype of running speed in this population, and also see if you can speculate a little bit about what's going to happen for genetic variation for that trait. So when we're addressing those types of questions, what we're really asking is the question of how populations respond to selection. And for thinking about this question, it's important to start out by realizing that most of the heritable traits that are found in living organisms are polygenic. I mentioned that earlier when talking about types of inheritance, right? So Mendel's cases are actually the exception, they're not the norm. The norm is for a trait to have polygenic inheritance. And what that means is that phenotypes for that trait will form a continuous distribution. And so I've got an example of that plotted here for one continuous trait that we've looked at before, which is human height. And here on the y-axis is the frequency of height in a population. And right, we aren't dwarf or tall. There's continuous variation. So some people will be on the shorter end of the spectrum, some on the taller, and we can talk about an average height as well. So for thinking about how populations might respond to selection, there are actually 3 different ways that selection could change this distribution. And it depends on where selection is acting on this distribution. So on our x-axis here, we're just going to imagine any continuous trait. If we think about that running example, what's happening there is all of the slowest runners are being eaten, and so they're not going to reproduce. And so selection's acting here on the low end of this curve. It could also be that selection acts against the average here. So being average isn't always a good thing. Or it could be that selection might act on both of these extremes at the same time. So it might be bad to be extreme, it might be better to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, so these different forms of selection have different names. So this first case that I gave here is referred to as directional selection. And I've got 2 graphs here that illustrate kind of the phenomenon of directional selection. And directional selection is going to move a population towards an extreme. So on the left-hand side, this graph shows the relationship between a phenotypic trait and an individual's biological fitness. So what this is indicating in the figure here is individuals that have the smaller trait have higher biological fitness. So what this figure is showing is that individuals that have the smaller trait have higher biological fitness. And so the consequence of directional selection in this case is going to be a shift of this curve towards the left. So the smaller individuals are going to become more frequent in the population. And the example of tail length in widow birds, you could use as an example of directional selection, right? The longer the tail, the more sexy the bird. So there's selection pressure driving towards longer and longer tails. But that actually brings up a point, which is that oftentimes directional selection can wind up running into a constraint. So in the widow bird example, although longer is better as far as females are concerned, a bird's tail can start to get so long that the bird really can't fly effectively anymore. And so in that case, we actually have to think beyond just a single trait. So we can't just be hyper-focused on tail length. We have to think about being able to fly and do other things. And so this is a case where there's a trade-off between reproduction and survival. So the survival cost of having a longer tail counterbalances the reproductive benefit of having a longer tail, and kind of puts constraints around the maximum tail length that we wind up observing in these birds. Still a lot longer than the tail length for the majority of birds, though. Okay, our second type of selection here is illustrated in green, and this type of selection is referred to as stabilizing selection. So this is a type of selection that is selecting against any extreme. So here looking at this trait-fitness relationship, basically anyone that has the intermediate trait has the greatest fitness. Either extreme has much lower fitness. And so that's actually going to push in the distribution of this trait and make that more narrow. So here's an example of a trait that is under stabilizing selection in humans, and it is the trait of human birth weight. So what this graph here is showing is on the x-axis we've got birth weight in pounds, and on y-axis we've got the percentage of the population that is at that birth rate. So what you see is one of these distributions where there is an optimal birth rate here. And a really interesting thing happens when we plot this against mortality rates for babies born at different birth weights. So notice that babies with very, very low birth weight have a very high percent mortality. And actually the same is also true for babies that have a very high birth weight. Probably because they have run into a lot of problems trying to fit through the birth canal. And so it's difficult for them to be birthed. So there's selection here acting against both low birth weight and really high birth weight. And so instead we wind up getting a narrow distribution of optimal birth weights, and most of the babies that are born are somewhere close to this optimum. And I think it can be helpful to think about more examples of this. And I've actually given you an example of stabilizing selection happening in certain populations in some previous lectures. It was a little ways back, so you may have to dust off some cobwebs to think about another example of this stabilizing selection. So I've tried to provide a little hint here of a molecule that I hope helps you figure out what that other example of stabilizing selection is. Okay, so we run into the third case, which is disruptive selection. Illustrated by that blue arrow. So this is a case where individuals that have more extreme versions of a trait have higher fitness. So here again is our graph of that trait on the x-axis, biological fitness on the y-axis, and so if you're somewhere in the middle, that's not favored. Instead, the two extremes are favored. And what you wind up getting for that is a trait frequency distribution that starts to have two separate peaks that differ from each other. So to give you an example of this, this actually came from a Biology in the News project from a couple years ago in snapdragon. So snapdragon flowers can occur in a very wide range of colors. But if you actually go out and survey snapdragon populations, what you'll discover is that you don't see a continuum of flower colors. Instead, you only find very dramatically different colors, which then leads to the question of, well, what happened? And as best we can tell, what's happened in those populations is driven by the animals that actually engage in reproduction for the flowers. So the bees and other animals that pollinate the snapdragons. And in particular, bees can be very visual foragers. So what winds up happening are bees wind up specializing on certain colors of flowers. So they'll key in and they'll go, okay, that white thing is really great, gives me good pollen, gives me good nectar, I love it. I'm going to just go after white flowers. Same thing for another bee might become a specialist on pink flowers and be hyper-focused just on pink flowers. So because the bees are not changing back and forth across flowers of different colors, then that's going to lead the white flowers to only interbreed with other white flowers, pink flowers to only interbreed with other pink flowers. To give you another example of this, here's a bird called the black-bellied seed cracker. And these birds specialize on the seeds of two different types of sedges. So sedge is a type of grass. And sedges have seeds that are either small or much larger and tougher. And if you look at babies from these birds, you'll find they have actually a continuous distribution in beak size. But Thomas Bates Smith followed 200 juvenile seed cracker birds through to adulthood. And what he found is that not all birds survive equally. And instead, he found that the survivors either had a much smaller bill or a much bigger bill. So it's actually not good to have kind of a one-size-fits-all beak because then you're not as good at cracking either the small seeds or the much larger seeds. So instead what you wind up with is actually a discontinuous distribution of beak sizes. So here's something else to think about. So I've tried to emphasize that selection itself does not create genetic variation. And so given that selection doesn't create genetic variation, here's another question. So how is it that selection often produces phenotypic extremes that go beyond what was seen prior to selection? So for example, if you go out in the wild and you look at squashes, you'll find squashes that vary in size, but you will not find a squash that is as big as this pumpkin that this guy is paddling around in. So here's a phenotypic extreme that has gone well beyond what you see in the wild. So how on earth did this pumpkin result in the absence of creating genetic variation? So to give you another example of this, here's an experiment with fruit flies, a lab experiment where biologists selected for either more bristles or fewer bristles. And here is the bristle number distribution in the original population. So all the flies had somewhere between 30 and 50 bristles. And then after selecting flies for more or fewer bristles, notice that the new distribution of bristle numbers is very different from what was present in the original population. So now we've got flies that have well under 30 bristles and 60 plus bristles. So none of that was present in this original population. How did that come about? Here's the thinking, and this is going to come back to an idea I hinted at previously. So remember, we're talking about traits that are polygenic, so there are multiple gene loci that are involved. What's happening is, as a result of selection, we're now seeing new allele combinations that previously would have been very rare. And so what's happening is we're seeing the expression of previously unexpressed variation, because in the wild population, those rare allele combinations just never come up. But once you start to select for some of those extremes, then you wind up seeing those allele combinations much more frequently. So that will wind up producing these much more extreme phenotypes. So it's not that new genetic variation suddenly appeared, it's just that now you're starting to see those rare allele combinations become much more common. Okay, so basically I've showed you that there are three possible ways that the phenotypic distribution can change in response to these different types of selection: directional, stabilizing, or disruptive selection. So now I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the overall consequences for genetic diversity in each of these cases. So with directional selection, that first case, pushing the population towards one extreme, in general, I want you to take a second and think about, what do you think that's going to do to genetic diversity in that population? And then I'll tell you about that. So in general, this is going to lead to a decrease in genetic diversity in that population. It's not going to be an extreme decrease, but it will decrease diversity. Same thing is going to be true for stabilizing selection. If you're selecting against the extreme phenotypes, That's going to reduce the number of extreme alleles, so genetic diversity will decrease. For disruptive selection, the jury is out. This is going to result in a different distribution of allele combinations than previously. So in general, it's not necessarily going to lead to a decrease in genetic diversity. It's just going to lead to a new distribution of the existing alleles. Okay, so again, I just want to emphasize from talking about some types of selection and about the shapes of selection, the shapes of response. I just want to re-emphasize that this process of evolution by natural selection is not a directed process. So this is not moving towards any predetermined endpoint. And this picture showing a change from an ape to a human to a bicyclist is incorrect. That is not how evolution happens. But I hope I've also helped illustrate that selection is not a random process. So selection can move in a range of different directions in different contexts.